So good evening, and thank you very much for coming for this very important event. It is a pleasure and a delight to be here. And I'm going to actually talk a little bit today about the research that I have done on sort of knowing what is it that sort of really help the women who reach the senior positions. And here are some depressing numbers, basically, of women on corporate boards of leading companies around the world, and it's 16.4%. And when you see this kind of numbers, what does research tell us about why do we see this figure? And and this is actually from Guardian, which basically said that men named David or David and John actually had more. Are there any Davids and Johns here? So the research has basically what I call doom and gloom. So most of the research has focused on the negative side of the barriers that women face to rising on the top. Women have to engage in ingratiation in order to reach the top. Men don't. There's the glass ceiling. If somehow women make it to the top, they see themselves standing on a glass cliff, which means that basically women disproportionately get promoted to senior positions when nobody else wants it, after a scandal or when the company is doing badly. And so the whole conversation here is about, why do women fail? And this creates this gender divide. And so one of the things that I wanted to do in this research is to really shift the conversation from this very negatively focused research on why do women fail to really look at, how can women succeed? What is it that sort of helps women reach the top and stay on the top? And so this research actually was, we interviewed 65 women who are in the financial services sector, which is known to be gender imbalanced, to really know what is it that helped them reach the top. And what were some of the challenges and how did they address them? And out of all these different interviews, 5 key lessons really came out very, very clearly. So the first one of them was authenticity. We always hear how women are not more confident, they need to be more confident, they need to network more, they need to speak up more. And what a lot of these women said is that you need to be who you are, because if you are not, you're trying to be something else. First of all, it's very stressful. Secondly, you are basically not going to look authentic, and you are not going to be unique. When you bring yourself to the plate, it provides you to be different from others rather than just trying to be like everyone else. So this was the first lesson. The second lesson was invest in yourself. So they said that a lot of the women that we spoke to actually said that, rather than just relying on what the organizations have to offer, which are one-size-fit-all kind of programs, it's important to be proactive and invest in yourself by taking different education, or in terms of really networking, joining support groups, really investing in yourself in terms of financially, but also in terms of time and effort. So that was something that a lot of basically women did. And this quote from Warren Buffett, I think, is very strong, that, no matter what happens, even the financial crisis, nobody's going to be able to take the knowledge, the capabilities that you have built. You take it with you wherever you go. So this was an important lesson. The second lesson, the third lesson was actually important. They said that there's a difference between mentors and sponsors. And, women are mentored to death, basically. This is what, Herminia Ibarra basically found from Harvard, found in her research. She said, and it comes across as work. Like you have to keep on working hard. You're almost like reporting to somebody when you have a mentor, particularly when the mentor is assigned to you. So what a lot of these women said is that, we didn't rely on our assigned mentor. What we did is we adopted mentors. So we targeted people who we want to have as mentors and went after them. These are people we met in grocery stores, we met in libraries, we met in things, our interest groups. In many cases, they were not from the same organization, or they were from the same organization, but they met them in very informal settings, and they adopted them and then turned them into sponsors, because you don't have sponsors assigned to you, right? Sponsors are people who are vouching for you, who are going to say, okay, hire her because I'm saying so. I'm vouching for her. And that's something that you need to develop. So they said we adopted mentors and then we developed them and converted them into sponsors. So that was something they said. And the last lesson they said was learn to say no. And this is something that I think women have a lot of problems doing. And many a times you get stuck on things that distract you from focusing on things that are really, really important, and take on challenging roles as well. That was very, very important, to really take on challenging roles. And one of the things they said is that, roles which have a direct impact on the profit and loss of the company are roles that give you visibility in the organization. And just to highlight the profit and loss aspect, you don't have to be in marketing or finance. Even if you are in HR, even if you are in communications, you can highlight that P&L part of your job. So no matter what you do in your organization, it's important to highlight the P&L and the challenge that you are sort of facing. And then I think I've already mentioned the last one, which is learning to say no. And that was something that was also very, very important. So here, when we started this research, we thought the first question is going to be work-life balance, or something that we always kind of look at. And that point was very, very low. It was there, but it came out much, much lower than a lot of these other things that they said we have to really look for. And this research has been very, personally, I have changed quite a bit of things that I used to do. As well in my work, in terms of how I interact with other people, by taking some of these lessons. So I hope that, I very much look forward to the discussion around some of these things that we found. Maybe, you don't agree with this, some of the things might be useful, some of the things might not. But overall, I hope this is something that is sort of relevant. Thank you.
I want to talk about working with men and women for gender equality. That's my subject today. Where is the down thingy? There we go. I want to start with the business case. These are some figures that came from McKinsey very recently. They were released this year, and basically they demonstrated, by looking at the constitution of the management of 1,000 businesses, and also the contribution of those businesses in terms of profitability and also in terms of value creation. And they discovered that in cases of gender diversity, when companies were in the top quartile, then there was a 21% increased likelihood that that company would have increased profitability, and a 27% increased likelihood that that value would be that they would be creating more value. So, clearly it works to have a more diverse leadership at the top. We all know this. I am slightly surprised that we're still having to prove it. And actually, that's a theme that I'm going to come back to more than once. And for me, one of the things that's really important is to look at workplace culture, and look not just at the top of the workplace, but actually in the middle. Because to get equal representation of men and women at the top means getting the workplace culture right in the middle, so that you keep your ambitious and talented women and also men, and have them able to rise through the organisation. So I think that's a really important thing to note. And I think also, whilst it's great that the focus today is positive, I also want to often use Leonard Cohen quote, that great poet, and say, there's a crack in everything, and that's where the light gets in. And actually, there is a crack. We do know that women are still the minority group in positions of power. We also know that women, more than men, tend to experience barriers to workplace progress due to socially constructed gender expectations. So that's some of the myths that Sucheta's already been talking about. Women are less ambitious. Women want to prioritise their family rather than their work. or even that actually women are considered to be good managers and good at more admin-related tasks, so they are funneled towards the jobs that aren't so much the line jobs that make the contribution to the P&L. So what I want to talk about today is how we can remove the barriers that get in the way of promotion by merit, because that's what men want and that's what women want, promotion by merit. So we did some research with men. Because we discovered when we had a look that while there was an awful lot of academic research about women and women's experience in the workplace, and also the problems, as Sucheta said, that women experience, there was actually very little academic research that had ever been done with men looking at what men think of the way the workplace is constructed, what men think are the advantages and the disadvantages of workplace culture. So we took advantage of this opportunity and went to speak to some men. So where we started was a group of 30 men who were mainly in middle management and early career, because they also were an audience that were less looked at. And we exposed them to some of these issues around workplace culture that we'd got from the academic research. And what we found was, unsurprisingly, men knew little about these issues, because by and large, men are the more privileged group. But actually, a lot of them were very motivated to get involved when they did see that there were these specific issues. And so we spent a mixed conference at which Gaenor, who's also on the panel, she was there as part of all of this. And we came up with a bunch of practical actions that people could take to actually address some of the problems that mean that actually you don't feel that you're being promoted by merit. And I'll talk about some of those, but actually ask me about more later. And because, as Sucheta also said, it's really important to get beyond anecdotes and the individual experiences that people can easily say, that's just you, that's just me. And so women don't talk about it, or men don't notice it. And actually put some numbers against this. So we've been working with a number of companies. We've got 12 big organisations involved so far to actually have a look at how some of these manifestations of workplace culture issues play out. Now, I've only got a little bit of the data back, but I'm going to peek under the bonnet and show you some of it right now. An early look. So, double standards. This is the issue that women, when they behave in the same way as men, can often feel that they are being judged more negatively. So what we found, and this is an aggregated data from 4 science institutes around Cambridge. So we've got 337 men and 445 women answering these questions. And 40% of women, which I think is quite a big chunk, 40% of women feel that they are judged unfairly, mainly by men, but also by women, because these things are not gender binary. But when it came to looking at men's opinions of this, 81% of men thought that this rarely happens to women. And what I'm talking about here is a lot of women say that actually they have to demonstrate their expertise again and again. It's not taken for granted as much as men's expertise. So it's back to the prove it and prove it again point that I made when I was talking about the business case. Or if you're proactive and assertive, you can be judged as someone who needs to wind her neck in. That's a phrase that's used about women and not used about men. So women are often felt that for lots of different reasons that they were being judged not by their merit, they were being unfairly judged. And then just to show you one more issue, this is about informal networks. Because we all know networking is important, but informal networks are the kind of networks we form in the sports club, in the bar after work, in the canteen, all the kind of daily contacts that we have with our colleagues at work. And they're really important because that's when you find out what's really going on. It's when you find out, who's got the power. It's when you find out kind of what the opportunity might be. It's where people think of you when they've got an opportunity. So those informal networks need to be quite strong. But in a lot of cases, people feel that actually these informal networks, for a lot of reasons, which I can discuss later, tend to be male-dominated. So, again, with the science companies, 57% of women reported that informal networks in their organisations were male-dominated, and therefore they felt they weren't getting a clear crack of the whip. Interestingly, it was pretty much an equal number of men who saw that as a problem. But then we looked at other organisations where there was a greater representation of women at all levels through the company. So this is a big public sector organisation. And here the findings were pretty different. 75% of senior women reported that networks were informal networks were male dominated. But again, 81% of men reported that they hadn't noticed the issue. And it's not surprising because, quite often we don't discuss these. We just take them on board as individuals. So I think this is an issue that we've got to address. And why we have to address it is partly because of this. I think one of the unintended consequences of the rightful scrutiny that there is on sexual harassment is that men have become more reluctant to form those social relationships that you need to have those good relationships, mixed gender relationships in the workplace. And Sheryl Sandberg's organisation did some research earlier this year with about 1,000 people. And what she found was that it was something like just over 50% of men said they now feel reluctant to spend time in situations, everyday situations in the workplace, like working late with a female on your own, travelling to a work meeting with just one female. So those kind of everyday occurrences, men feel a little more uncomfortable about. I think this is a big problem. I think we need to think about how to tackle it. Now, the people in my research had a bunch of different ideas. I think this is the tip of the iceberg. I think this is much more challenging than this would suggest. But just to pick up on one or two of the suggestions about making gender mixed networking more acceptable, more normal, it was things like charging new joiners to have coffee with 10 new people of the opposite gender in their first 3 months. So there was facilitating these kind of contacts to happen. Doing things like pairing up so that you have a buddy to give you 2 hours, cover you for 2 hours when necessary in the workplace, or even amplify your contributions in meetings. Listen out for those interruptions that both men and women experience and actually fill in the gaps and invite the person that was interrupted to carry on. Much easier if somebody else does that for you. So just a couple of examples about informal networking, but it'd be great maybe to have a discussion about networking because it's so important to all our career progress as we go along. So thank you very much.
Jill, you mentioned that you sometimes feel a little bit tired of having to explain why we're talking about this issue and why perhaps it's a good idea to promote women and have women in business. But I think we are going to talk about that, if you don't mind. And Janet, I know it's something that you've thought about this, whether there is a strong business case that can be made for the merit of having boards or senior levels of organisations, more fairly mixed between men and women.
Well, yes. I mean, in my experience, I chair a global law firm, but I also have a number of external board roles. And over the years, I've seen the gender balance on those boards change from being the only woman in the room and the only woman chairing a board, and the social discussion being exclusively about football and having to learn football in order to participate, to a situation where there's a much better gender mix. So on all of my boards, there are at least 35% women. On several, it's 50-50. And it does give a different tone to the conversation, I think. And it does... Not that women all take one particular position on one particular issue, because they don't, but particularly on issues around the people agenda, I think there is a real focus on making sure that gets attention. And there's a real focus around risk issues, perhaps more than in my experience there has been when there are fewer women around the table, and perhaps a better sort of comprehension of where everybody is coming from. So in the law firm, my law firm is global, and there we also have cultural diversity, and I've found that also is very important. I mean, I don't really think of diversity just in terms of gender. I think from the perspective of our business, the greater diversity of all kinds you can get in your teams, social diversity, cultural diversity, the better decisions you make, because you've got a different range of perspectives coming to an issue.
Yes, yes. Gaenor, what about you? And how do you make a sort of hard-edged business case for what, seems fairly obvious, but nonetheless has to be argued for?
Well, I think one of the things I was resonating with me is you still have to come back to the business case, unfortunately. And the reason is it is hard to persuade people. If you're a male-dominated board, it's hard to persuade them to consciously take a risk on doing something different. Mm-hmm. So therefore, I was constantly thinking of different ways to produce evidence or data. I did work for an accountancy firm, so data was really key as to why we had a problem, and that actually the problem was more complicated than people thought. And unfortunately, I think we are still in the phase that we have to keep repeating that business case. So the research that the two panellists have already done, I think is still really needed, unfortunately. But please, can we all keep going? I think it's really important.
And the McKinsey work often does get cited, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And Helen, what do you find yourself having to say or contribute or base arguments on?
Well, I think we've seen quite a big sea change now. As Janet was saying, in terms of non-executive representation on boards. So we had the Norway quotas in 2006, and we had a Davies report in 2011 in the UK, and both of those initiatives have really changed the composition. Certainly the bigger boards where representation of women is really pretty high now. I mean, I think it's about 30. It's getting towards 30% in the UK, and I've heard chairman's language around it change over that period of time. So they started off by saying, so this was sort of when the Davies report first came out. We know this is a good thing, but we can't exactly explain why. But we sort of intuitively feel it's right when we have women on our boards that the conversation is better. And somehow we don't have so much groupthink or whatever. I think that the why for those chairmen is really being substantially answered. But I do think what's very interesting is the how is still a bit of a tricky issue. And I think that, both what Jill and Sucheta both highlighted some of the sort of the subtle layers of issues that are still going on in the executive pipeline. I mean, still in the UK, 97%, I think, is the latest statistic, of CEOs are men. So even though, representation at non-exec at board level has improved substantially, and we're saying, okay, maybe we don't need to make the case for that, the business case for changing things in the executive pipeline at senior levels is still not well ingrained in the way, entrenched in a way that the difference is being made. So there are many. It's like peeling an onion solving this problem.
So I mean, when it comes to the how, of course, one of the issues that does get raised is the notion of quotas, but it is controversial. I mean, probably on this panel, there are different views, and certainly in business. That would be the case, and different countries right around the world have different policies. But I mean, Sucheta, this is something you've looked at in your research. From your point of view, do you think quotas are helpful or not helpful in terms of getting more women to senior positions?
So as a researcher, I'm going to stay away from my opinion, and I'm going to let the experts give their opinion. I am going to talk about evidence.
We're not research.
I'm going to talk about evidence. And so the research that we did on 1,100 companies from 43 different countries, and we looked at quotas and what kind of effect they have, we found that quotas have a very strong effect on getting more women on the board. Which obviously, obvious when you make. But what we found is that quota actually had a negative effect on getting women in executive teams. So when companies are trying to adhere to quotas, the tendency is to fill women up in non-executive positions where they don't have a direct impact on the strategies of the companies. The second effect we found also is that quotas positively affected greater turnover of women, and part of the turnover was positive because it creates new opportunities. So we actually looked at, my RA pretty much broke her neck looking at this data, but we looked at all these events and individually categorized these events into whether it was positive turnover or negative turnover, and we found that quota had a very strong positive effect on both types of turnovers. It does create opportunities, but there was also negative turnover in terms of creating a revolving door effect for women as well. So in terms of my opinion, well, the evidence is what I can offer, but quotas is a mixed bag. That's basically what our research said, is that yes, it does open up the doors, but on the other hand, it shuts the doors when it comes to executive teams, and also retention is an issue.
And there can be a difference between quotas and then targets, which can be another lever that businesses might use. I mean, any other contributions on this, either for or against?
Well, I was going to give I suppose it is an anecdote, because I used to hear a lot of people, if I was talking to the talent at PwC coming up through the ranks, most of them would say I wouldn't want to get to a senior position just because of a quota. But I was on a panel with a young director, so coming up to partner next to me. I asked her what she thought of quotas, and she said to me, do you know, Gaenor, in front of everyone, she said, I would like quotas because it would give me hope. And as you know, their hero was like supposed to be in charge of making sure people like her got to the top, and it was just like one of those ground open up, decline, disappear in. But it really made me think that actually, if she had somebody like that who's very positive normally, hasn't got hope, we really need to do something really quite drastic. And personally, I still haven't got to the point where I'm in favour of quotas, but it really made me think. Just keep thinking about this. The time may come when we just feel we have to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not in favour of quotas. I think if you find yourself on a board and everybody else thinks you're only there to make up the numbers, you're on a hiding to nothing from the start. Having said that, I did find myself on a panel with the remarkable Sandy Okoro, who is an incredible force of nature in the legal world, and is now General Counsel at the World Bank. And she said, if you turn it around the other way and say, is it okay to have quotas for men on boards? And is it okay to say even 70% of boards should be men? You might think differently. And I thought that was quite a smart observation, really.
Jill, is it something you've formed a view on?
I think it can cause problems not only at the top but in the middle. I was working with a company the other day, and the Women's Network has a stated policy of wanting to have more representation of women at the top. That's how they put it. And the implication of that for both men and women who were commenting privately in my survey was horror. They were saying, the women were saying, we want to be promoted on merit, we don't want people thinking we're not there. And the men were saying, there is no point in my being here, I'm not going to have a chance because a woman will get my role. So I think it's quite difficult. And the other thing is, even though that was an informal policy, it was something coming from the women's group, it was elided in people's minds with corporate policy. And I think it's tricky. I think it's a very tricky one.
Yeah. Just to add something, it's very difficult though, isn't it, to break entrenched power structures that have been in place for a very long time. And we can see where we've had quotas in Norway and voluntary targets in the UK, that actually there's been quite a sea change in the composition of boards. And I also can't quite get off the fence on the side of quotas. But equally, the fact that, for example, women representation in the executive pipeline in the UK is going backwards just shows that, we need the interventions that we're going to have, if we're going to change it, need to be more powerful than the interventions we've had in the past. So if it's not quotas, perhaps it's targets or some other things that we've not, perhaps we haven't discovered it yet. But definitely, unfortunately, change is not yet really happening in a way that you can noticeably measure it, except where we've put the targets in place.
Yeah. So if it's not just the numbers, then it is about behaviour, culture, some of the things that you touched on in your research. Do you have examples where you have observed something that has been effective, is beginning to work? Tips for people here, or whether going into business or involved in business. In your experience, what can work that isn't about the numbers? Sucheta?
So one of the stories, and this was a personal story, that one of the executives, a senior executive from a pharmaceutical company, she was saying how they had problems getting male participation in their gender diversity events. So they changed the title of their next event to Sex at Work. And basically they had loads and loads of participation, but the point was that they said it was very difficult to get male participation in terms of getting them in the conversation, but once they were in, then it created much broader engagement and more open dialogue as well. Other forms of interviews, for example, I mean there is a lot of research on where the unconscious bias is the maximum, and there are certain situations where the unconscious bias is the rampant, and there are ways to actually reduce unconscious bias using very design principles or using innovation principles. For example, when you're introducing a new product, one of the things that is to really have a diverse team involved. You just don't want one scientist coming up with a product and introducing it in the market. But when you are trying to hire somebody, which is such a strong, you're acquiring human capital, you just have one person interviewing that person and you basically then just hire. But if you use some of the innovation principles to really sort of to these to some of the pipeline issues, I think that would be a new way of thinking about this.
Mm-hmm. And Jill, and you know, topic you were addressing very much, yeah.
I think one example I would give you is one of the men that participated in the very first kind of 40-man sample. He went on, because he then talked about all of this and was aware of it, he went on to be on the Diversity Council at Aviva. And Aviva have just launched this really groundbreaking policy of giving 26 weeks paid leave to men and women, paid parental leave. And whilst that in itself is a great thing, because it took some getting through, I think. Financially, I think it was a massive pitch. But what they've said about it is it started a lot of conversations amongst the men, like, can I really go to my boss and talk about taking this? How is that going to affect my career? Are people going to think more badly of me? And these public conversations, where colleagues have turned around and gone, welcome to my world. Actually, people have been having these conversations for ages, and he said that it's been a huge thing, that men have suddenly started to say, I get it now in a way that I didn't get it before, and it's opened the door to all sorts of conversations. So that one's a good one, I think.
Yes, but costs. I mean,
oh yes,
costs,
I know. Yes,
so
yes.
It is about business, kind of putting money where the mouth is, isn't it? Yeah. What about you? What have you seen working?
Well, actually, I had some good news today. I learned that our Australian practice, and we have quite large practice in Australia, has won the Employer of Choice for Gender Equality Award. There is apparently there is an Australian workplace gender equality agency, which is a step in the right direction. So how have they done it? Well, I mean, no organisation is perfect, and I'm sure there is more we can do. But we do regard ourselves as a very meritocratic organisation. We do have unconscious bias training for all our partners worldwide, and we have that delivered in their native language. So there is no possibility that people don't understand. But I think a lot of our systems, when it comes to performance management, for example, things are done on a collaborative basis. So as a group of partners, we discuss and score everybody. So there is no possibility of one person misscoring. And we have quite a lot of nudging in the business, so that if you're pitching, for example, for work, someone will focus on the gender mix of the team. When you're putting teams together, someone will say, well, what will the client expect, and what do they look like? We should mirror that. So there's quite a lot of that going on.
What would you say brought your company to that point? I mean, was it sort of enlightened early leadership? Was it some, the staff being stubborn until they got these things? What's made
a lot of it comes from the top down. So, I drive, have driven a lot of it for a long time. But we have, in the UK, for example, our managing director is female. She has worked flexibly. We believe in that. And Australia, one of our co-managing partners is female. In Spain, it's a woman. So, there is more visibility at a higher level and a desire to do it. But we're very clear. It's not just gender for us. And we've just had some time away looking at what we need in 10 years' time in all areas, and with our people. If you look at the generation that's coming in, and I've just discovered that Jill's son is one of my trainees. So take Meredith. What is it going to take to retain him in the business? That whole generation are looking for more flexible careers. We need to give them more flexibility. They're looking to travel. We need to make sure that we have international secondments in place. I think it's about retaining your talent everywhere, and that increased flexibility and agility will work for everyone. I had a great example last week. One of my partners in Germany phoned me up to talk about, he just wanted some career, being German, he was very clear on what his next career move was going to be, and he wanted some advice on how to get there. But one of the things he was saying was, I've got young children, and it's really struck me, I want to see them. So, I make sure that I factor in time to go and see them every day, and then I work later. And I need to bring that in for my female staff because we haven't got enough women partners, and I need to make sure we get there. And, there might have been a bit of, if I tell her all this, she's going to make sure I get promoted, but I don't think so. I think it is a genuine thing, and I think, there is a whole generation of men who are having girls who are suddenly thinking, I want a workplace that works for them. So I think a lot of things are coming together. That mean it's not necessarily just gender. It is about making a workplace that works for everybody, and our people are doing that themselves. If you 5-10 years ago, you'd have football teams. Now we have mixed softball teams, and we've got a choir competition coming up, and everybody participates in that. So I think it's sort of top down, but it's bottom up as well.
Gaenor, what does success look like? Where have you seen success?
Well, so I think leadership tone from the top is absolutely critical, but unfortunately it's not enough. One of my frustrations is that you get a good tone from the top and you make a little bit of difference, but you don't make quite enough. So you think, it's tone at the next level down, the tone at the middle management, which Jill focused. Yeah, that has to work. Then you've got to look at recruitment. You've got to look at promotion. You've got to look at sort of retention and what I call experienced high recruitment. So in other words, one of the issues that we had found was that women were not leaving faster than men. That was a myth. But when they did leave, they were replaced by a man. So hence the kind of, as you went up the pyramid, it got kind of greyer and greyer. So the problem is that you do something like you do bias awareness training for everyone. Everyone thought it was fantastic. Right, good, done. and you say, sorry, now we've got to do promotions. Right, sorry, now you've got to do experience hire. Why are the partners we bring in externally? We've got 30% of our internal promotes are female, 12% of our external promotes are female. There's always more to do because we're starting from the very poor statistics that we showed from the beginning. Yeah. So I think it's really a recognition that it's got to be sort of tackled at lots of levels. Is there's a really clear statement that everyone has to sort of, we're all in this together. Now you're right, everyone wants to make a difference here. I haven't ever found anyone who says, sorry, I'm happy with the status quo. It's more, that's the challenge now is the how, as Helen said earlier, is, you're right, what are you going to do? And all these 5 or 6 things, what are you going to do to make a difference? And everyone's got a different role to play.
Yeah. So let's talk about networking, this word that we all use now. And so I'm curious what each of you actually understand by it or think is, effective networking, and whether it is an answer or not an answer. And have you done it? Has it worked for you? Where does networking fit in in your life, Jill?
Me personally.
Yeah, well, your research and your life. I mean, your observation, you know.
I think
Because we all spend a lot of time saying networking is really important.
yes, exactly. We're doing it strategically.
Yes.
Doing it strategically is very important. Like most things in a career, to answer it personally for a minute, there are times in your life when you pay attention to what's going on in front of you, when you've got small children, etc. And then there are times in your life when you actually kind of look outwards. And actually, kind of once my kids were grown, I looked a lot outwards, and actually a lot of my friends gave me a lot of help. And it's useful, male friends and female friends, kind of telling you what's out there. So I think from a personal level, it's a great thing. From a research point of view, I think it's one of the most important issues that we face, because actually that issue of knowing that there is an opportunity, or knowing that actually maybe you don't get on with that individual, but there's somebody over there in that department that actually does things differently. I think those things are really important to a career. And if you get it wrong, and if you've got too narrow vision, you can really put off, really frustrated. I mean, people leave their jobs because they don't like their boss. That's the principal reason, isn't it? That's the first thing. So actually, the bigger your networks internally, the more likely it is that you're going to find your niche.
So internal and
external.
So we have to be very busy, don't we? Networking internally, networking externally, and do the job. Yeah. Interesting. What about you, Janet? Is that part of your world?
Yeah, it is, but not consciously. I think I come across a lot of people in my line of work and on my various boards, and much more so now. It's about finding opportunities for people and helping people, and then people help you. It's about picking up people in the business and sponsoring them. I think within our business, and for our, if you come back to women's networks, and is there a role for that? I think there is a role for helping people in a professional services firm. It's really about developing business and finding your own clients, and opportunities to do that together. We certainly encourage that and help that through a women's network. But I'm increasingly coming to the view that's sort of had its time. A women's network has probably had its time, because it's becoming much more the way we do things around here. Whereas, a few years ago we set one up because that seemed like a good idea to drive change. But it's certainly
evolving.
It's important, I think, I think one of the career things in a professional services firm is you work really, really, really hard, and you think you're doing a great job, and someone will notice. But actually, you need to get yourself into a position where you can develop business and your own clients, and that helps you tremendously. Unless somebody tells you that and helps you along the way, there is a risk that you can come up for air after 10 years and realise that you're not quite where you should be.
I thought you were going to say
recognise that.
I thought you were going to say something different, actually, because a lot of the young women that I coach and mentor, first of all, I have to tell them that networking is just building relationships, which you do naturally anyway. It's not having to do something you don't want to do. So recognise what you're doing. But secondly, there will be some targeted ones that I'm afraid I am going to ask you to do. Imagine me speaking to somebody, because you find they kind of expect, if I work hard, somebody will notice. Whereas you're going to say, right, who needs to know that you want to be made partner? And they go, well, I don't know. Well, does his boss, right? How are we going to set up that you meet those people? And that you can see them going, can I really do that? Wouldn't I be being a nuisance? And so that's quite a lot of the coaching I do, is to people will have networks, but they're not necessarily confident to use them for themselves. They would use them to help a client, but they wouldn't use it for themselves. So it's really giving people the invitation to do that I find is very helpful.
Helen?
Well, I think a lot is spoken, isn't it, about men and women network in different ways, and that may be true. If I just talk a bit about my own personal experience, I was given some advice, probably being coached by someone like Gaenor, that I should spend at least 20% of my working week networking, and at the beginning I thought it was really extraordinary, because I thought what I did is I did my job, and then if I had any spare time I might go and chat to someone. But actually it's very interesting, because if you and this is just networking within an organisation, if you build relationships and you go around and you say what's going on in your department and all that sort of thing, you build a much more integrated view of what the organisation is trying to achieve, and you're much more likely to be in important conversations or be able to influence things that are important or hear about things that you need to know about. And that networking within your organisation also needs to extend, as you get more senior, needs to extend outside your organisation. So I no longer see networking as just how do I find out about maybe career opportunities. I find it really more about sort of almost being in a sort of a communication sort of web of friendships and relationships where I learn. I it's great to be able to help people. People say, can I have a cup of coffee and can I have some advice? And then you advise people and then you get advice from other people. And actually that is actually just a very enjoyable, pleasant, not a transactional way of doing business. And I think in a way, it's been given a bit of a silly title, really. It's about self-promotion. I don't really think of it like that at all now. I think about it just being a good business person.
And it gives you, I would add, I think it gives you a wider perspective, greater understanding of your sector,
of course.
Hear about other ways of doing things. Sucheta,
the radio, isn't it? You don't know what you can whether or not it's going to be interesting.
Big plug for the radio. Excellent. Sucheta.
So I think most of it has already been said about networking, but one of the things I think is whenever we think about networking, we always think about people at the lower level trying to network with people at the higher level. And I think with the whole millennial culture and, so many changes happening in the world today, I think the whole idea of reverse mentoring, where there is a lot of...
Will you explain what that is?
Yeah.
Because basically, for example, there has been, and that actually provides opportunities for younger for younger people just joining the organization to actually inform and teach some of the senior managers who actually have trouble understanding how social media works. For example, what is the mindset of the millennials? And rather than just thinking that, the juniors have this pressure of networking with the seniors, I think it's equally important for senior managers and senior people who have come from a very different era of how things were. And a lot of change has happened within a very short period of time, and many of them feel disconnected with that. So there is a lot of opportunity for a lot of senior managers to sort of get mentoring from junior people as well. And increasingly this is becoming prevalent in organizations where senior people have a lot to learn from junior people. And I'm one example of that. I basically kind of always learn a lot. And in fact, some of my strongest champions are my students, actually. So I think it really works. The reverse mentoring, I think, is very, very important. And networking is not just about people at the lower level trying to, whatever level, however you define what lower level means, but basically junior people trying to sort of network, it's all the way. And peer mentoring has been supposed to be much, much more valuable than top-down mentoring. There is research after research that has shown that people learn a lot more from their peers because they relate a lot better. They learn a lot better. They're much more open and less intimidated with people who are at the same level. So I think when we talk about networking and this vertical thing of just looking top, but horizontal peer interaction is extremely important, and so is the reverse relationships as well, which I think people don't talk about as much. But I think it's as important for senior people to network with junior people to learn from them as much as it is for junior people to learn from senior people.
Yeah, very interesting. I'll throw it open in a minute, but just one last sort of quick point. We've been largely talking about, big companies, big corporations and boards. But of course, a lot of business is, small businesses and entrepreneurs and people, working through and turning through a number of different companies. Do you think everything we've been talking about is the same and relates in that sector, or that perhaps sometimes there's a different sort of energy and capacity for change sometimes in the smaller
I think if you look at the stats for entrepreneurs, would I be right in saying there are lots of women? Lots of women. And that many women who are sort of rejecting a more sort of, possibly a more conventional, more male structure, whatever, are opting to set up and run their own businesses. I don't know the numbers, but I certainly, my understanding is that that women entrepreneurs are thriving. So I guess
right,
they're
yeah.
making they're creating their own cultures as well in that process, aren't they?
Yes.
I don't know if you did any research on that at all.
Yes, actually, and the thing is that the trends of women entrepreneurship has been significantly more in emerging economies like China. For example, China has some of the highest rates of women entrepreneurs and rise and growth of women entrepreneurs compared to even some of the Western countries. So these trends are sometimes very surprising for us to see that some of the countries that we would like, for example, Colombia has the highest representation of women in executive positions and also in entrepreneurial trends as well. So these countries that we typically don't see as, would be really thriving for women are the ones on the forefront, in many cases ahead of some of the Western countries. So this whole phenomenon of sort of entrepreneurship is very interesting.
That's interesting. Jill, the research and the work you've been doing has any of that been with smaller companies?
Very little of it, but I was an entrepreneur. I built and sold 2 market research
There you
companies.
go.
So, and like many of my female contemporaries, actually, we got to a stage, particularly when we had kids. We had our kids pretty young, where our bosses are ringing up, worked in communications and in advertising, and going, "Where the hell are you? Saturday night, 8 o'clock?" And you're going, "I'm looking after my baby."
Yeah.
And so we formed our own businesses, and a lot of us did pretty well. And you're right, creating your own culture. I mean, the drive to do it with a lot of people was to be more flexible, to be more in control. And then when you're there, you can build your own culture. And I was very cognizant of particularly the demands of people who had young children. And I've always been when I had my companies until 5 years ago, it was highly important to me to create an environment that worked with the way that people really were. So yeah, I think it's kind of it's an advantage because you are much more in control. Yeah.
And I think I've found as well when I'm on panels, you do kind of get the question, "Oh, you're a large employer again. It's easy for you," and there is some truth in that. We can invest in equal paternity policies, but we can invest more. But on the other side, I was on a panel with a lady whose own business she was running was a website for advertising for temporary positions. She calls it 2 for 3 days. Give her a little plug. She was fantastic. And she said, actually, I'm getting loads of traction with small businesses who really do want people who actually only work 2-3 days. I want a marketing person, but I only want the 2 to 3 days. So it wasn't just women setting up their own business. Actually, that small, flexible business community was a great environment for diversity.
Yeah. Janet?
Not really anything to add. My clients are big.
You're the big companies. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I think it's been an amazing discussion, drawing together real evidence. I think Sucheta's absolutely right about that, but also real experience as well, and bringing the marriage of that together. So, questions. We have a microphone. Emma's got the microphone. It's not because I don't think you can talk loud. It's because we're recording it. I think. So,
lovely. Well, first of all, thank you so much. That was a really interesting and informative panel. My question, and I think we've touched partially on this, but I'd really like to hear some further thoughts. Is the role for government and law as a tool to encourage diversity? My background, I'm a PhD student in law and been a practicing lawyer for a number of years, and I'm particularly passionate about corporate diversity, and I do think there is a role outside of quotas for governments to set a good example and also perhaps to use law as a tool to further diversity. And just a bit of a commendation for my country. The Canadian government made a concerted effort, the Prime Minister, to have a gender balanced and a diverse cabinet in his first cabinet appointment, which has been really inspiring to see women in very senior roles excelling and promoting the jurisdiction.
Sucheta, I know that was part of some of your research, wasn't it?
So I think one of the things that we found, which was very had a very strong effect on reducing turnover, as well as encouraging more women in executive teams as well, was corporate governance code. So instead of having that, I think having a corporate governance code was very important. And the second thing that you pointed out, we looked at the percentage of females in political, in holding political offices, and that was actually very, very strong effect as well. So I think in terms of really being on the forefront and setting standards by having more women elected in political offices actually provides the championing for issues, for this kind of issue, gains salience in discussion, and much more, and that's much more effective than this strong arming of quotas. In Norway, a lot of companies delisted because they didn't want to have quotas, or because they didn't want to be bound by quotas. So there was an increase of companies that delisted because they didn't want to be part of it. They reduced the size of their boards because it was easier to get the 40% for smaller boards than for larger boards. So you have all sorts of loopholes coming out of quotas that was kind of unintended consequences. But I think indirect effects of political representation was very important.
Role of government? Anyone else want to chip in on, or don't have to?
Well, I've got a point of view perhaps on corporate governance. I think the role of the shareholders and the attitudes amongst the shareholders, who are ultimately the owners of the business, does make a very big difference. And my first 20 years I worked for a private business called Mars, which is owned by a very strong family, and it's a very strong private business. And Forrest Mars only had daughters, and from the moment I arrived, the shareholders were definitely interested in promoting diversity. So I was very fortunate that I spent the first 20 years of my career in an environment which was actually much more benign from a diversity point of view than actually normal PLC world. I think if you look at the shareholder constituency in PLC world, I don't think they are heavily invested in diversity as being important. And I think that is one of the quite big reasons why senior executives are not taking risks with making, senior, high-profile, more diverse appointments, because they've got the shareholders on their back who, whatever they say, are looking for this quarter's results or this year's results. And I think you can do things, with government pressure and corporate governance codes and guidelines to change a bit of that zeitgeist. We've seen it around executive pay. I'm not saying that's where it needs to be, but this, the conversation has changed since government started agitating about it. And you need to get, I think, the shareholder constituency to say, I think it's important that you have a diverse senior executive team to make CEOs, etc., to be more comfortable taking some, perhaps what might feel like a more risky decision. I think there's something to be done there.
Even directors' term limits. Actually, what we found is that countries where there were directors' term limits, that actually helped increase. Because one of the reasons why you have fewer women is because people have been on the board forever. The moment you actually make the board more flexible and the turnover on the board, increase the turnover on the board, it opens up doors for women to get on the board. Many a times when some of the people who have been on the board for like 10, 15, whatever years, they leave, they are replaced by women. So directors' term limits was a very, very important, strong effect on having women on boards.
Good point. Another question or contribution? Emma? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more specifically on the motherhood penalty and this phenomenon that mothers are more significantly disadvantaged. My background is I'm an MBA student now, but I was a patent attorney and also a mother, and I found significant change in attitudes after I became a mother, despite being, in my view, more productive and more efficient.
Janet, you're the lawyer.
I've never heard the term the motherhood penalty before. My child is in the audience. I have too. I've never seen it in that way, and I don't think my organisation sees it in that way at all. I can give you an example of how people can misguidedly think they are helping, which is my managing partner in Spain is a woman. And she found herself pregnant with twins. And the initial conversation was around, crikey, she'll never be able to manage that. So, perhaps she should step down from that role. And when the response was, well, no, we simply need to make sure that we put around her all the support she needs so that she can carry on doing the role. That was the right decision, and that's what she's doing, and it's fantastic. The knee-jerk reaction was it wasn't bad. It was well intentioned to help. Sometimes people can sort of go in and try and help you and save you from a decision that you need to make for yourself. But I honestly don't think there is a motherhood penalty. I think it's very difficult, and again, I'm in a professional services firm, and at just about the age when you might be hoping to achieve partnership, you might also be hoping to have children, and people put these things off longer and longer. So I think there are difficult decisions to be made yourself in terms of how you organise your life, but it is perfectly possible to manage everything, and the environment is encouraging you to do that and to stay, and not to sort of self-select out of the business. I think everything we're trying to do is to keep people and support people.
Jill, do you recognise it in the research?
Just to pick up on what you said, there is a lot of academic research, and they call it benevolent sexism, the phenomenon that you've been talking about. And it's one of the things that my survey is measuring, and it's coming up a lot, which is basically people taking away your control. They're kind of making assumptions, and it is often around the fact that you've got a family. I think that's one thing. I think another thing is the way that we organise maternity leave in this country is a little bit short-sighted, and it's very individual. I mean, you go in and negotiate personally with your manager at the point at which you're pregnant, generally. So I think certainly in my PhD research with mothers, career mothers and their daughters, one of the big things I found was that there was a lack of awareness of the different options of flexibility that there are, and so women often went into those negotiations assuming that they needed to go part-time. There's this feeling of balance, got to have the balance right, and so that the negotiation would be based on that. So actually my own view is that these negotiations ought to be a little bit broader, and actually the organisation has a responsibility. I know this is iconoclastic, but I think the organisation has a responsibility also to think about this manageable experience that people have of having children, and think about ways within the team of managing it over a longer period, rather than just this one individual negotiation over and over and over again. So I think that's where innovation is needed.
And I mean, the growth of flexible working as opposed to part-time is a liberate, it does offer opportunities.
My experience is that there shouldn't be a motherhood penalty, and in most cases there isn't. There are a few of the assumptions, which is the benevolent type assumptions, which is assuming that now she's got 3 children, surely she's not ambitious. But I usually find when that is said to me, if you challenge that person and say, I know the individual, she is ambitious, that's it. That's accepted, and this person carries on going. There is a bit. The data would show there is a bit of a part-time penalty. And so I think that I absolutely agree with Jill, and that's what I always try and do. Really honest conversations with men and women now as to when you have a family, how are you going to manage this, rather than assuming you have to go part-time. It may be fine, but you have to recognise that could have some issues that could have an impact on your career, rightly or wrongly, but the data would say it does, so we ought to have an honest conversation about that.
Well, it's tricky. I mean, I do agree that there definitely shouldn't be one. I mean, if you look at the top 10% of earners, in the decade of the 20s, 50% of women now, so women leaving university can get the good jobs. If you look at the top 10% of earners, people in their 40s and 50s, that's down to half of that. So something happens in the 30s, and it's a very easy default, I think, for everyone to go, it's about women having children childcare, going part-time, whatever. And I think, I really think that has to, of course it is important that women are supported through a period of time when they've got, more demands on, different, etc. But it isn't the only reason, I don't think, why women don't emerge in their 40s with the same seniority as men emerge into their 40s. And, it's one of these sort of, slightly more subtle, complicated issues again. But I was very struck by something that Sucheta said about, make P&L be core to your job. And what happens in your 30s, that's often when you said, would you like to go and be country manager of Poland? And you're a young man and you're thinking, this is my chance to really prove myself, and you say yes, and you're a pregnant woman and you think, actually this is the last time I want to go and be a country manager in Poland. So I do think there is something about high profile assignments and risk appetite where there can be, it's a bit like the partner conversation, there may well be a divergence during those years when women are having children. And I think if that is true, and if that is a genuine insight, which it seems to be very fair to me, because there's some other research that supports it as well, I think women then have to say, well, I'm going to do that, that high-profile assignment in my 40s. It's not over. By the time maybe the men are forging ahead in their 40s, and I'm not feeling quite at the same pace. But it's not. People are going to work a long time. Yeah. The idea that your career is done and dusted by the time you're 45 is, that's something of our parents' generation. And actually, I think that, I think women have to sort of be strong in saying, well, okay, if I can't do exactly everything I want to do, when my children are young, I'm still going to go and, seek for those opportunities when I'm a bit older.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Another question? One. So Emma, one over here on the right, and then we'll take. We'll take the one at the back. That's fine, Emma, and then we'll come to the right.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the issue of quotas, because I sort of felt that conversation petered out a bit, but I was very interested in what Jill was saying, because it seemed what you were saying about meritocracy, for example, and the responses, it reminded me very much of the kind of discourse around positive discrimination in the United States. Now, clearly, positive discrimination and quotas are different concepts, and there are a bunch of historical, cultural reasons why positive discrimination is applied in the ways in which it's applied in the United States. But I wondered whether any of you think there might be a role for that in the context of getting more women into particular kinds of positions. And then I've sort of got a just second follow-up question about that, which is really about, of course, there is resentment around positive discrimination, but a lot of the resentment around positive discrimination is maybe because people misunderstand how it actually works, and there are a lot of common misconceptions around that. So if you were going to advocate for positive discrimination, do you think at the same time putting forward a certain sort of education policy, if you like, around it would work? Or do you think neither of those things would work, or they at all?
Jill.
I think that there's a great case for positive discrimination as in quotas in the public sector. I think with particularly representatives, our elected representatives, I think that there's not much of an argument that I can see against that, and I think that would help, and that would make a difference to the way that countries are generally run. I think that the idea of educating people is tricky. The people have already been mentioning this whole issue around inclusion. Is a many-headed dragon, and one issue doesn't necessarily help the others. So I think it's. I think it's quite difficult. I think a little bit like the motherhood penalty, there's a little bit of an embedded assumption that positive discrimination is a bad thing, and therefore it's you need to reframe the debate. And the way I would do it is actually having more conversation around how merit is defined, because that's what we want. But how is merit defined, and is merit defined in a way that does allow for more inclusion? So that's where I would put my focus.
Anyone else on the panel want to chip
So
in
I
on this
think
one?
whenever this issue of quotas and things like that comes up, I think one quote of Boris Groysberg actually from Harvard comes to mind, that gender diversity is about counting numbers and inclusion is about making the numbers count. So should we be focusing on counting numbers, or should we be focusing on actually making the women who actually get into the organizations matter in the organizations? And there is always this sort of tension that you fill in people with quotas, and then, like, for example, Norway has 40% women in on the boards, and 0% of them are executive directors. You just fill up women in just to sign the quota, rather than sort of making the numbers count, which actually is very, very important
So we'll go to our last question on this side, because I think then we'll be due to wrap up. We can probably hear you, but we're recording it, so it's just great to use the mic. Thank you.
I was interested in one of Jill's slides that said that 46% of women felt disadvantaged by men and women. So I guess the elephant is, how much are senior female managers a threat to other females within the organisation?
The figures that I was quoting, one of the things I measure is whether these experiences of workplace culture issues are at the hands of men or at the hands of women, perceptually. And all these things, because a lot of it is based on our assumptions of what the masculine is and what the feminine is, and we translate that kind of willy-nilly into, that's what my expectation is of that individual woman, therefore, or that individual man. We all carry that. So I think women carry that as much as men. So I don't think it's necessarily kind of sinister or people defending their power or their position. I think that's one thing. And I think the other thing is there's some quite interesting research around queen bees, and some of the women that really don't help other women, and you get that famous quote about there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women. And I'm kind of on board with that, because actually it is tougher to be female. It's tougher still if you are female and of colour. And so I think we do need to be bending over backwards a bit to kind of to help people by pulling people up and having people pull us up. So but not everybody is that way inclined.
I only ever met one queen bee in my career, but it was very early in my career, and it was pretty shocking. But I think that's, again, perhaps I'm fortunate in my workplace that we're pretty intolerant of bad behaviour.
Wherever it comes from. Gaenor?
I think I would agree with you that I see it very rarely, and if I do see it, it's that societal issue. I mean, I do have a little bit of a saying I give to my colleagues, is that really only women have style issues. When we were talking about whether someone should be promoted, and that's just an assumption about how women should behave. It's the women are criticised a bit more if they're a bit more aggressive or assertive. So women are bossy. And men are strong. So and that's a sweeping generalisation, but that's where I think some of that comment comes from. I agree with you. It very rarely is it sinister.
There is actually a very classic research by Robbie Neely from Harvard on of law firms, mind you, where they actually found that having women in senior positions had a negative effect on women in the middle level positions. And one of the main reasons for that was because being women in senior positions, there was a backlash against the women in senior positions when they were seen as supporting other women. They were seen as clubbish. They were seen as being sort of very much in group out group kind of behavior. So it was much more a coping mechanism against that backlash rather than this sinister explanation, because women in the senior positions are torn between their leadership identity and their feminine identity, and when they look at their feminine identity as being a liability, the the only coping mechanism that they have is to move away from that and try to be more attached to the leadership identity, which is defined mainly in male characteristics. So it's not that queen bees are inherently bad, but it's basically a coping mechanism that women have to use in some cases. And what they found is that this syndrome, or like this phenomenon of women at the top not helping women at the lower level and creating a negative was highest when there was low gender integration. They called it the low gender integration culture. But in companies in law firms where there was strong gender integration culture, the effect was very positive. So it is, again, comes back to context. It's much less about women at the top, but it's much more about making the numbers count. What kind of context do you have in the organization? That's going to determine the kind of dynamics that you have.
Helen?
And no, I think you said that, and that's perfect.
Great. Well, it was a perfect panel in every way. So can we please show our appreciation